Alrighty then. So, this is how this is going to play out now. I'm going to talk very briefly about remembering my parents. Just in brief, talk about my parents. So, first of all, my dad. My dad was very old when he passed away. I was very young when he passed away, so I don't have the best memories of him. My dad would take me fishing sometimes, and he would play cards. He'd play like go fish with me, and my father would also he'd take me fishing. He chopped wood. He would chop firewood, and he would go see me at Boy Scouts. So on the whole, fairly good memories of my dad. Not the greatest person, not the greatest individual. He was a very strong conservative, and I didn't care too much for his morals and his moral paternalistic guidance. um, I don't respect my dad's religious or political beliefs. He was very strongly devoted to the Republican Party, which I'm definitely against. Definitely a pre-war conservative type. Definitely you see that Great Depression mentality in him. He would save up on a lot of canned goods. His childhood was the Great Depression and the war, and he never really talked about the war. He certainly didn't tell me about his dad being drafted but not serving in the American Army. He did speak a second language. He spoke a dialect of Rhinish or some type of Rhineland German. He spoke a dialect of Rhineland German, and his ancestors had settled in the frontier in the 1800s, the mid 1800s. Definitely had a frontier mentality, but also a Great Depression and other type of mentalities. He bought me a train set when I was a kid. He took me fishing. He chopped firewood. He played cards. So if I ever said anything overtly negative or critical about my father, I do apologize. He was not entirely a bad person. So on the whole, I try to keep the best memories about my father. I try to retain the best memories of my dad, but he was just way too far. He was like 4 generations apart from me. I am a millennial. I was born in the 80s, and I grew up in the 90s and the aughts. So, worlds away from how he was raised, okay? This guy graduated from high school in the 50s, and I still have his yearbook. And they wore suits and ties, which is amazing. They actually wore suits and ties to their high school graduation. He was a farmer. He later became a rancher, and he sold his ranch. I'm not gonna get into that. And yeah, his health went bad, and he died. And that's it with my dad. With my mom, she was a boomer. My mother was a very beautiful lady. I've seen some high school photos of her, and she was just stunningly beautiful for her time. Absolute gorgeous woman. Um, Finest hippie dresses. She grew up in the 60s, and she was a flower child. She was a flower child, and she was definitely a child of the 1960s, without a doubt. I don't know how much of the counterculture influenced her. The summer of love, the summer of free love, and Woodstock, and all of that stuff. I don't know how much she was taken in by that. She grew up right through the civil rights era. Her childhood was the civil rights era, and her teenage years was the Vietnam War period and the counterculture movement and hippiedom, Woodstock, and all of that stuff, 1969. you know, in her early adulthood, in her 20s, she would have seen Watergate. She would have seen Nixon and Watergate and the Arab oil embargo. So my mother got me a lot of toys, G.I. Joe and Transformer toys when I was growing up in the 1990s. And she was a flower child. She was in her 20s in the 1970s. She lived a long time. She died from cancer. Unfortunately, she died because of cancer in her 70s. And she was born in the 50s. And she grew up in post war America, middle class America, the golden age of middle class America. And just like other boomers, she owned a house in her 20s. She owned a house. She mortgaged and loaned a house and paid it off in her 20s. She met my dad in the 80s. That's when I was born, was in the late 80s. And it was just a different time when everything was much cheaper. You could own a house and you could own a vehicle and you could marry and pretty much live out the American dream in the 1970s before prices went up skyrocketing high because of the federal government debt ceiling and all of that. So I have very fond and good memories about my mother. Wonderful person. She could cook all sorts of things. She cooked very nicely. And she bought me a bunch of toys when I was a kid, like G.I. Joe and Transformers. She liked Disney, which is amazing now considering what they've done for the last 30 plus years to bring that franchise to utter shit. Neither of my parents understood my mentality. My mother grew up in a conservative Christian right-wing household, a white Christian household, very conservative, and I reject those values very much. I was brought up a Baptist, and I reject the Baptist church. Although my dad was a Methodist, and I reject the Methodist and the Baptist churches, and I reject these evangelical Protestant churches entirely. So, yeah, her father was a Democrat, but she became a Republican. They were conservatives. They were Christian conservatives, evangelical Christian conservatives, if you want to say that. My mother certainly was an evangelical Christian. um, they tried to raise me like a fundamentalist or whatever, so I was brought up in a religious household. When I was 18, I believed in evolution, and I stopped believing in God. And then I gradually came back to religion in my late 20s, but from from the time that I was 17 to my late 20s, I was an atheist. So I'm actually, or an agnostic or whatever. I believed in evolution. Um, so that's kind of coverage of my life. My mom cooked for me. She did amazing things. She was not a bad person at all, obviously. Wonderful person. She lent me money. She tried to get me to work, and I worked for a few years, but I bailed out of it. I gave up, and I just drew unemployment and whatnot, and I didn't go back to work. And I just gave up out of it. It's like I opted out of society. The way that I see it, society is a failure. Western society is a failure. And the Western mindset is a complete and absolute failure. It separated the secular from the spiritual. Industrialization destroyed the nuclear family and the extended family. Industrialization destroyed the balance of gender roles. It destroyed the balance of culture. And it really just ruined modern society. Modern society is a broken, drug-addicted, horrendously awful society, and that's something that I'm thankful about my mom. She did not let me become addicted to drugs. She would not let me drink. She would not let me take drugs, and I'm thankful for that. And so I don't have a lot of strong addictions, and I didn't have any addictions when I was a teenager, but I lived a pretty lonely and miserable life. She would not let me have any friends come over from school, and so I did not have a lot of friends, and that led to basically a life of loneliness and a lot of misery that accompanied it. And I definitely do not think that the church has any answers. I do not think that this abstract concept of a God that we refer to as a God has any answers. And I'm definitely not a conservative. I was raised I was raised in a post-war American household, like a boomer household that basically was overtly conservative, and I reject that. I absolutely reject that. Millennials rebelled against the boomers and Gen X. Millennials are like, known to be quite a progressive generation or whatever, and a diverse generation. And then Gen Z is like this right wing generation that is re embracing hardline trad cath values or whatever. And like Gen Z is going to be red pilled or super black pilled about women and race and all of that crap and stuff. And it's just, they grew up with DEI. They were called the, what was it called? The, post 9/11 generation. I didn't grow up post 9/11, and I didn't grow up with all of these values around gender reassignment, multiculturalism. That wasn't really on the table when I was a child and a teenager and a young adult. And the DEI stuff only started happening from my late 20s and early 30s. In 2014 to 2025 was kind of when the woke stuff happened. And it's like, my mother never cared about it. She never cared about safe spaces for women. And she was way too old and way too conservative and Republican to really accept those kind of values and stuff. So thankfully for me, my mother never really embraced the sexual revolution, and she never really embraced any of those kind of values and stuff. But she was a hippie and she was a flower child from the 1960s and 70s. And then I grew up in the 90s. I grew up with Back to the Future, Saved by the Bell, Barney the Dinosaur, Sesame Street, and G.I. Joe, the Transformers. That is what was on television in the early 90s. Already quite progressive BS, almost very left-wing type of media, but that's what was on television. The Sopranos, Friends was a very popular television show in the 90s. And so that's what I grew up watching. Not really a lot of interest in books, which is really sad. Not a lot of interest in reading books and stuff, which was something that I did later in my teens. I started reading a lot more books in my teens and 20s. But yeah, my mother did a lot for me, and I wanted to do this stream to remember my parents. My father passed away around the start of the new millennium, and my mother passed away from cancer earlier this year. And so now it is just me. I am legitimately on my own. And this is going to be my first Christmas with my mother gone. And it's just going to be me. I live alone. Both my parents are dead, and, I just wanted to do this to kind of remember them. And I'm not going to try to draw it out. So, Rick Perry in the chat says, "Hi, hello there, Rick Perry, how are you?" The Great says, "Hi in chat, how are you doing, The Great?" Rick Perry has a waving hand sign. Rick Perry says that the 1950s was still Abbott and Costello era. Amazing to think. Yeah, I think that entire interwar trend from the 1920s was largely gone after the war. I think the 50s was more about McCarthyism. Rick Perry says, "I think it took the 1970s, to really bring the counterculture's values into fruition." You might be right. You're basically right. Very leftist decade, a very left-leaning decade. Um, the 1940s was probably more left-leaning than the 70s, to be honest, with the FDR era and all of that. Rick Perry says that cooking skills are foundational. I have become fairly competent this past few years. And the Great says that Raven is a great cook, I bet. No, I don't think she is, The Great. I disagree with you. Until I see it with my own eyes, I'm going to say no. The Great says, "You are not sewer sliding after this, right?" I'm not for sure what you mean by that, The Great. Rick Perry says that good mothers are developmentally vital. I had terrible parents that I believe consequently shaped my proclivity for a lifelong procurement of mother figures and my subsequent identification with them. I'm very sorry to hear that, Rick Perry. Did you not have any good sisters that could have helped to raise you when you were young? Or, like, did you not have any good maternal figures as a kid? But, yeah, I understand what you mean. My mother was a wonderful person, and all of the maternalist love that I could have ever had came from her. Um, she told me that I was being abusive when she left and went to the nursing home. She told me that I was abusive to her, which I apologized and stuff, but I don't know what to say. One of Abbott and Costello's last films was a sci-fi in the 50s, where they went to Mars. Dude, there's a lot of things about going to Mars in the 50s. And then Rick Perry says that he was an only child. Oh, okay, I see. So that's why you relied on all those girlfriends subsequently. So I just wanted to do this as sort of a memorial to my parents. I think that I might pay some money and go and read like the newspaper sections of my dad from back in the day and my mom's and stuff, and just kind of really think about what my parents did for me. I wouldn't exist if it wasn't for my parents, my dad or my mom. And I hate that I gave my mother's clothing away. I think I should have kept some of her clothing just to remember her by. I have some of my dad's things still. I definitely have a lot of things from my mom that I'm going to put in a box and keep for decades to come. But yeah, unfortunately, my parents died when I was still very young, and now I have to go through the world, pretty much learning how to think and live for myself. I have to cook and clean for myself. I have to pay my own bills, and I have to live a completely independent life. There's nobody that cares about me to look after me anymore, so that's over with now. I'm just glad that it was in my 30s and not in my 20s. Thankfully, this all happened when I was in my 30s, and so Now I have, I have to plan out what I'm going to do. So I just wanted to give this time to really think about my parents, what they did, and remember the good things about them. And Rick Perry says that I mapped out my whole life in a journal, very detailed. It's very helpful in piecing things together, gives you a panoramic and ordered perspective. So, not sure where I'm going to go from here now. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to give some time to think about my parents and remember them, and that's pretty much it.